Welcome viewers to Module 2. The Module 2 states Capitalism as an evolving economic system, basic features of capitalism. First of all, we define the concept of capitalism. Capitalism is basically defined by an economic system whereby the private ownership of assets are being done, and basically they are treated as different means of production with the objective of profit making. So by capitalism we actually mean the accumulation of wealth or capital governed by the forces of market, that is the demand and supply, and finally we actually address to the needs of the economy. Whenever we are defining by the word of capitalism, we are inviting certain features of capitalism. The very first feature of capitalism is competition. So as we say that in a market-oriented economy, the competitive forces put an end to the monopoly power or concentration of wealth in the hands of few. So by competition it means the market forces, which are basically the forces of demand and supply, equate with each other to satisfy the interest of the producers and the consumers, who are considered as the economic agents. So thereby the consumers are being offered to pay the highest price as per their purchasing power, and based on that producers supply the goods and services, and finally they are moving for the profit maximization. So the generation of the profits coupled by the mutual interest which is satisfied by the consumers by paying the market price defines the concept of a competitive structure. Moreover, in this competitive structure, we invite a number of markets whereby the businesses compete with each other and thereby get an optimum solution. So an economic framework is deeply embedded within the competitive structure of capitalism. The second feature of capitalism refers to the freedom of enterprise, occupation and control. That means in a market-oriented framework, we can get the origin of an entrepreneurial class or a group of people who can set up their new ideas and thereby begin or start a business. So by that, they are basically governed by the motto of profit maximization, which is at part their interest and at part their skills. This calls for agreements, this calls for collaborations, or this calls for mutual partnerships among the employers. That is what the freedom to start a business or to begin an enterprise is deeply embedded within a capitalist structure. Thirdly, the capitalism is deeply rooted within the private ownership of the property. This is actually against the motto of the socialism, where the ownership is basically taken up by the public participation, or we say public ownership of assets. By private property, we mean that it has to come up with an individual choice or individual authority over a certain wealth or an asset. So private enterprises are given more and more access to different modes of production, which thereby invites the role of private sector in a market-oriented setup. Individuals and the businesses can also transfer their property. They also can participate in the systems, and thereby they can explain the deterioration or the progression of the economic landscape. This calls for the acquisition of the private ownership of assets as one of the most important features of the capitalism. Most importantly, whenever we talk about the businesses or producers in a market-oriented economy, they are governed by their self-interest. And the self-interest is basically the maximization of profit. So whenever we talk by the self-interest, it basically gets into the private motive of individuals and the businesses who will be delivering the goods and services, where they might be getting the benefit or the society may be getting the benefit directly or indirectly. But the first priority is private maximization or private profit maximization. Thereby we invite the basic principles of economics whereby we quote Adam Smith, an invisible hand, that in a market-oriented setup, this invisible hand equates the interest of both the demand and the supply, and thereby the societal advantages are taken care of. This is how we can invite the role of market or the role of market forces. In a capitalist society, there is another important feature is minimizing the role of state. This is absolutely against the motto of the socialism. Here state will be acting a role of a guardian or a catalytic role, but state will not intervene in the decision-making power. So it will be given an autonomy to the private sector or to the private units, and the government will come up to impose rules, taxes, tariffs, but at the same time government can also intervene during the times of any exigencies. But for the private property or the acquisition of the private wealth, it is the private players or the capitalist classes which must play a pivotal role. There are some other additional features of capitalism. One of the additional features of capitalism is consumer sovereignty. This is very important to recognize the consumer choice in a market. When we deal with the consumer behavior and when we deal with the consumer problem of choice, it basically given the freedom to choose among a large set of goods and services. This calls for a proper, well-defined market structure, where the market size plays an important role. The investors are attracted to expand this market, and thereby the consumer choice also are playing a pivotal role in the expansion of the market size. More importantly, as it is said, the role of entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs are basically the new startups or the new business setups which are pivotal in the creation of ideas, the creation of new business units, and thereby accelerating the progression of an economy or of a society. So thereby entrepreneurs are basically competitive, and they want to accumulate wealth which goes for the benefit of the society or the benefit of the economy. Among the important facets of capitalism, we go by the factors of production. By factors of production, we define a production function where the output and inputs are interlinked with each other. This calls for private enterprise, who can control the factors of production, particularly the land, labor, and capital. Land is a natural resource. Labor refers to the manpower, and capital refers to the physical capital, machineries and equipments, or the physical infrastructure. Private companies are basically the combination of these factors, who thereby will generate a surplus. And this surplus may be rent-seeking, may be profit-making, but finally it has to be distributed for the needs of the society. And these productive factors can be privately owned or publicly owned. And finally, as per the Marx philosophy in the framework of political economy, always the surplus will be distributed in form of profits or in forms of the redistribution of income. So the factors of production play a very important role in this capitalistic structure. We move on to the next important concept of accumulation of wealth and crisis, which we refer as accumulation and crisis. Whenever we are discussing about the creation of capitalism or creation of the private property, there is always a kind of a possibility that the accumulation will be the hands of few, and thereby the crisis factor can come up. So when we talk about the expropriation or the reorganization of the resources, there requires a proper distributional structure, and that can be taken up by the intervention of an authority. That means the separation of the labor from the ownership or control of the means of the production. If it is left to the market forces, there is a possibility of the evolving of a monopoly capitalism in the long run, which may not be good for the society. So expansion of the productive capacities, excluding them into social groups, and also the benefits that are coming up from the different capacities, this needs to be well defined. Because the wealth is created for the benefit of the society as well as for the benefit of the individuals. But individuals should not be taking up the majority of the wealth, as it has to be distributed in form of different agents to the society. This gets into the extension of the capitalist society or the capitalist system into various sectors. By sectors, we mean the sectors of development or the different kind of sectors of industries like agriculture, trade, commerce, finance, whereby we can take up the labor in various forms. Because the labor can be employed in agriculture, the labor depending upon the skill can be employed in industry, and finally with the advent of technology, it can be also be employed in the technological sectors. So how the reproduction of the labor takes place, and that is how the reproduction takes place, that is an important part of the capitalism. Also we look by the privatization and also the public-private interactions. This is one of the major facets of the capitalism where it says that the state role is minimal, but that does not withdraw the role of state. So for a better functioning, public-private partnerships are also an extension of a capitalist system in a dynamic world. So the process of transforming public into private goods and services, and thereby creation of profit opportunities, all of them are inherent within the society, but that should not exclude the needs of the masses. Most of the times it is seen that any public property converted to private is actually addressing the private interest or the vested interest. This should not go with the tune of the capitalist system or its extensions. So thereby it can reach to the poor, to the marginalized, and how the benefits can be distributed. These are some of the extensions regarding the accumulation of wealth that can come up. Otherwise it will lead to financial or social or economic crisis. When we define the role of the capitalist, by the definition of capitalist we mean that they are basically interested in the generation of the profits. So among them, by the nature of the capitalist who are interested in the generation of the profits, thereby called the intervention of the state to go for checks and balances. Capitalist economies also invite innovations, because these innovations go in the line of financial technologies, financial development, and how a capitalist structure can evolve over time. This goes back to the basic foundations of the Marxian philosophy, who have already opined that in most of the developed economies, the industrial revolution had come up, and after that there had been a growth of more capitalist classes. Because the after effects of industrial revolution had been the growth of innovative technologies or innovations or sophistications in the nature of the businesses. So thereafter we see that the surpluses which are evolved over time, the markets that are evolved over time, all of them have contributed to the theory of capital accumulation. Further, when we talk about the profit maximizing principle, we say that whenever the rate of profit is increasing or it is exceeding the rate of the existing levels, then the rising productivity may be a factor, the upgradation of skills may be a factor, or better specialization or the division of labor takes place. There is also a crisis of over-accumulation of capital. That is what people say in the world of economics as creation of excess capacities. This over-accumulation of capital or wealth may be due to the crisis of plenty. That means to manage, to distribute, and to optimally use these over resources may be a problem at times. So this may happen due to over technological innovations, over dependence on the trade and commerce, and greater dominance of the capitalist classes in the world economy. When we go by the role of the economists within the political framework and we recognize their opinions that over capital accumulation may lead to acute social inequalities, because this is in tune with the era of globalization. So in the era of the market orientation, competitive structure, when we invite the topic of globalization, we see that more and more integration to the world economy may create to bombarding of information or creation of excess wealth. So this may lead to businesses to operate more than their capacities and basically may lead to underutilization at times. So thereby the control over a larger amount of assets may be concentrated among the hands of few. and the distribution of income may be skewed. So this is one of the major cause of the crisis that can be the after effects of overaccumulation of wealth. So according to the crisis theory, a capital crisis may come up whenever there is exappropriation of resources or overproduction of the resources at times. The next important development that takes place in the accumulation part is the visibility of the class struggle. That is about the class differentiation that can crop up because of globalization. This leads to interpersonal relationships and their deterioration, the growth of new rich and the new poor, and thereby access to different kind of economic resources, access to economic channels, who are basically getting the benefit from the capitalist classes, and the poor and marginalized who are getting rid of. So this has been one of the very famous phenomena since 1980s, when there has been the waves of liberalization or globalization has come up across majority of the world economies. And the businesses have habituated or adjusted themselves to the modern forces and to the global capitalist consumerism. So when we are using the word consumerism, we means changes in the lifestyle, changes in the food habits, and also in the demand that is created in accordance with the world needs. So this is basically a very challenging issue given within an ecology. So finally what we observe that the capitalism boils down to not only economic crisis but also the ecological crisis, because we are taking care of the entire wealth creation but at the cost of environmental degradation. We move on to the next important concept of modern corporations. So by modern corporations, we mean the role of the multinational corporations within the market-oriented framework, which have emerged over times, and they are actually integrating to the rest of the world within the tune of globalization. So by the modern corporations, we mean the efficiency that they are generating due to the collaboration of different management effective practices. The shareholders are coming up as the stakeholders of this particular profit or the asset, and at the same time, they are basically looking into the liabilities, which are very limited for them, and they have a tendency to control over the larger proportion of assets. So by the modern corporations, we mean the well-established and well-defined institutional framework who have an economic entity and which has been deep-rooted in the United States of America, who are having the techniques of spreading across the world due to their technological innovations and due to their mode of capitalistic classes. Thereby, they take hold of all forms of capital, starting from human capital, physical capital, financial capital, and with that, they actually capitalize and they spread their tentacles all over the economic functionings. And more importantly, the consumerism which has evolved over time. The dynamics of the consumerism has been the result of this kind of globalization which has been carried forwarded by the role of corporations, who are basically looking for the voting rights for all the shareholders, taking care of more and more governance issues like accountability and transparency, and making a level playing field for making a good business. So whenever we talk about sustainable development goals or we talk about ease of doing good business, a larger part is dependent upon the efficiency of these corporations who are spread across the world or across different territories. These are the modern versions of the capitalist classes that have emerged over time. Now we move on to monopoly capitalism, because monopoly capitalism is actually another dimension of modern corporations. And thereby we invite the topic as monopoly capitalism and alternative perspectives. So what we mean by the monopoly capitalism is that we are operating within a different market structure. And one of the predominant market structure today that is prevailing is an oligopolistic structure, where we have few producers, but they are having a stiff competition among them. they believe in the product differentiation of the brand, and they believe on the strategic actions. That means the strategies are taken by one firm will affect the reaction of the other firms, and thereby they frame their reaction functions and they operate accordingly. So they build a rival relationships but within a competitive framework. And that is how they fundamentally dominate the modern capitalist countries. According to different monopoly capital theories, we find out about the transformation that have occurred in the production structure. The production structure has become more and more sophisticated, more and more alienated to the modern transformations in terms of technological know-how, in terms of modern algorithms, and also in terms of the artificial intelligence that have come over time. With this, the dominance of the MNCs have occurred over the countries, particularly the advanced nations of the world have the tendency to dominate over the followers, and thereby they follow a leader-follower model. This also goes back to some of the economic stories of some of the advanced countries and the success stories within the world. Among the success stories, we have the Asian tigers, or many of the East Asian countries which have taken up a pivotal role in the globalization because they were the enthusiastic liberalizers. But if we refer to India within the South Asia, they are the cautious liberalizers because they have taken up the openness but in a trial and error method, not by opening up all the sectors at one go but one after the other. So this economic surplus which is generated as a result of globalization needs to be distributed and also needs to be reproduced because the reproduction of capital is one of the basic facets of the Marxian philosophy, whereby we can see creation of capital over time. So capitalism, as being said, is basically a potential fund which is created for creating a democratic sector, whereby the state has a role to play, but mostly it is dominated by the MNCs and the corporations. Among the other alternatives to monopoly capitalism, we consider the company behavior of oligopolistic structure. The monopoly capital also is no longer an exception because by the monopoly capital, we are accommodating all schools of economic thoughts, and thereby we can see the oligopolistic behavior is more deep-rooted and pronounced in place. More importantly, today when we talk about the macro foundations, they are deep-rooted in the micro factors because any kind of macro decisions are being built up from the micro foundations. So it is a mixture of micro and macro factors in the decision-making process. And thereby we talk about oligopolistic sectors, we talk about monopolistic sectors, and thereby we merge up the individual decision making and the aggregate decision making in the entire monopoly capitalism. So thereby the monopoly capitalism takes up a broader shape in the capitalistic structure. So in this particular module, we basically address on these following dimensions. First of all, we build up the concept of capitalism. We actually discuss the underlying features of capitalism like the private property ownership, the little government intervention, and also about the market-oriented structure. We discuss about the consequences of capitalism which may lead to overaccumulation of wealth and creation of crisis in terms of social inequality. We talk about the emerging concept of the MNCs and the modern corporation, how they are dominating the world economy and how they give rise to more waves of globalization across the world. And finally, we talk about the alternatives to monopoly capitalism in terms of the definitions of oligopolistic structure. And thereby the monopoly capitalism is ongoing within the dynamic structure of world economy.